Hello, I want to welcome you all to this discussion as part of the European Humanitarian Forum. And today, the topic at hand is the treatment of families with perceived ISIS affiliation. 6 million people were displaced by fighting between ISIS and the Iraqi government. Most of those people in the intervening years have been able to return home, but over 1 million have not. And some of them haven't been able to because one of their family members, usually a male first-degree relative, so a father, brother, spouse, son, is alleged by security forces, by the government, or by the local community to have been a member of ISIS or a fighter in ISIS. Now, this might be because he actually was an ISIS fighter or member, or it might be that a community member claimed that he was for some ulterior motive. And his name has now ended up on a list of people who are wanted by the security forces for ties to ISIS. These wanted individuals are sometimes arrested, charged and imprisoned, or are missing or were killed. Their immediate family members are then given the label of ISIS affiliated. And for years now, many of these families have been suffering from a range of illegal measures that have been infringing on their rights. To be clear, the family members, often women and young children, aren't said to have committed a crime and aren't wanted by the judiciary. So it's important that we understand what these families are facing and the rights that are being abrogated. We will now see a video. It's a video that captures the voices of the very people who are being perceived as ISIS affiliated and who are being forced to engage today in Iraq in a process known as tabriya, a process that requires someone to appear before a judge and attest to the guilt of their husband, their son, in joining ISIS in order to be allowed to get a stamp that shows that the security forces do not view them as a security risk, and a stamp that is essential to allowing them to get access to even the most basic government services. So here is a video to lay that out for us.
العشيرة تقريبا بالكامل منتمية إلها لداعش وأخوي هم من ضمنهم.
إذا ما تسوي تبرئة يعني أنت معناها بعدك على نهج داعش.
تبرئة ماكو يعني قانونيا، يعني اكو واحد يتبرى من أهله، اكو واحد يتبرى من أخوه أبوه زوجه، ماكو.
زلمتي يعني محكوم مؤبد وأنا بقوم يعني أتبرى من عنده ما تبرى.
تقريبا سنة 2016 تزوجت، بس تزوجت يعني ما كان داعشي، كان ممرض مستشفى موصل. ورا ما تزوجت تقريبا شهرين راح التحق ويا داعش رجلي. عشت وياه تقريبا 6 شهور. سنة نهاية 2016 أنا تزوجت، كنت حامل بابني. هو بقى دوامه بالمستشفى، يعني مثل ما هو صح راح وياهم التحق، بس إنه بقى يداوم بالمستشفى كممرض. تقريبا ما طولت 4 أشهر 5 أشهر عفتو طلعت. يعني بقى بالموصل هو وأخويا وأبويا بقوا هناك انفقدوا، يعني ما نعرف لحد هسه ما نعرف أي شيء عنهم.
أخوتي وأبوي يعني ورا ما انضموا يعني ضربتهم يعني الطيارة، راحوا يعني عوائلهم هسه يعني قاعد مأجر واحد ويعني يمهلوا. اللي زلمته يعني موجود ما سوت تبرية منه، بس اللي مات راح يعني سوى تبرية منهم، يعني على مدهم أطفالهن يسوون يعني مستمسكات شيء. زوجي يعني أنا ما أقدر أتبرى منه، هو ما يقبله وأنا ما أريد أتبرى منه، لأن أمل يعني بل شي يطلع شي.
تبرية ما سويت، يريدون من عندي أروح على التموينية يقول لي سوي تبرية حتى يعني تستلمين موادك الغذائية، ما تستلمين إذا ما تسوين تبرية. أنا قلت لهم ما أسوي تبرية، زلمتي مظلوم يعني، وفوقها يعني محكوم باكر إذا سوي تبرية تنقطع إنه المواجهة وهاي، وهو يعني تعبان بالسجن وهاي. ما أسوي تبرية حتى إذا ما أستلم المواد، ما أسوي تبرية.
التبرئة صارت مستمسك رسمي، هسه وين ما تروح لازم شايل التبرئة وياك، أي دائرة تطبها يقول لك مثل أنت من عوائل داعش أريد التبرئة مالتك، حتى تأكد إنه أنت مسوية تبرئة أو لا. ثانيا إذا ما تسوي تبرئة يعني أنت معناها بعدك يعني على نهج داعش، أنت بعدك تريدين داعش، بعدك تهنين لداعش، مثل ما تصغين بزوجك أو مثل يعني أنت مساندة زوجك بهالشي هذا، فلازم تسوي تبرئة.
انت من تروح تتبرب للمحكمة تشتكي على هذا الشخص المطلوب اللي هو الداعشي، وتتبرى منه يعني قانونيا وعشائريا.
أطفالي راح أبني لهم مستقبلهم، يشوفون حياتهم، يتعلمون على الثقافة، يتعلمون يعني يتكلمون، يتعلمون يتطورون، ما يظلون خايفين، ما يظلون يعني بقلق.
والله احنا يعني حاليا ما عندنا يعني مستقبلنا شنو تقول ضايع، ما عندنا مستقبل، بس نقول يعني بلش يعني على الأيام الجاية يعني يصير لنا مستقبلنا يعني يصير زين أحسن هيك.
يعني أنا عشت 3 مراحل بحياتي، مرحلة قبل داعش اللي هي كنت يم أهلي، ومرحلة وقت داعش، وهسه هاي المرحلة. أنا أشوف هسه الحياة اللي عايشتها أنا هسه أحسن من هذول المرحلتين. هسه أنا متعينة الحمد لله، وعندي طفل، شغلتي كاملة، أقدر أروح أرجع براحتي بحريتي.
الحياة هسه بعد التبرئة يعني ما ترجع طبيعية مثل قبل.
I think that's an important way of setting the scene for this conversation, and showing and giving a platform to those who are directly affected by these issues. Dana, I'd like to turn to you with my first question. I would love to hear from you a more detailed analysis of the lawfulness, or indeed the lack of lawfulness, of these measures that are being imposed to directly limit the rights of these families with perceived ISIS affiliation, and specifically whether these measures may indeed constitute collective punishment.
Thanks, Belkis. So I want to start by noting that the process that the women in the video are referring to collectively as tebre'a, in fact, encompasses a range of different tribal, legal, and administrative processes, including the tribal denouncement process, as you have mentioned, which is actually called tebre'a, the legal criminal process, and the physical document that someone might carry to prove that they've completed the process. Women themselves often refer to it collectively as tebre'a, so that's what we're using as a reference here. So Iraqi law does not establish a link between obtaining security clearance through tebre'a and access to administrative and judicial procedures. There's no provision in the criminal procedure code or even in a terrorism statute that's used to charge suspects that invokes family members or tebre'a. In fact, a directive published in Baghdad in 2019 required courts in Nineveh Governorate to halt this procedure. And yet we know from these interviews and from our work in Iraq that this practice continues throughout former IS-held areas. In some instances, judges have told us that they are aware that it's not legal and that they feel pressured to do this because of the influence of local security actors. In other instances, we know that courts are actively choosing to interpret the law this way. The process of tebre'a does have established roots in tribal justice mechanisms that predate the conflict with ISIS, but its attachment to mandatory judicial and administrative processes, such as civil documentation, creates a situation in which women are absolutely punished through compelled divorce, through exposure to exploitative security apparatuses for crimes that they themselves are not accused of. I want to emphasize, as you've said, Belkis, these women are not suspects of crimes, nor are they being investigated for criminal acts. Both Iraqi and international law limit criminal procedures to individuals accused of committing a crime. Instead, by allowing security forces to compel women to undergo tebre'a, Iraq is subjecting the wives of former IS fighters and their family members to a form of collective punishment, to guilt by association.
Thanks, Dana, for clearly laying out how these families really should not be facing any of the human rights curtailments that they are. Now, one of the main issues that we see these families facing is a challenge to getting their civil documents. Kayla, I'm wondering if we can turn to you. Can you explain to us in a bit more detail what documents we're referring to when we say civil documentation, why these families are missing documents to begin with and need replacements, what the process is to getting those replacement documents, and what obstacles these families in particular are facing in that regard? And finally, it would be great if you could touch on what the impact is to these families if they're unable to get their documents.
Thanks, Belkis. Every individual has the right to legal identity and recognition by the state and before the law. This allows them to access further rights and benefits in their country. In practice, this is realized through a simple piece of civil documentation, which each of us carry: birth certificate, national ID, passport, and so forth. However, in Iraq, many individuals are missing essential pieces of civil documentation. They may have been lost or destroyed during conflict or during displacement, but also during the period of ISIS control, ISIS ascribed to themselves many of the functions of a state in areas under their control, including issuance of their own civil documentation, which became no longer recognized after their defeat. In fact, it was considered a risk when fleeing areas of ISIS control to be found carrying ISIS-issued civil documentation. So some individuals destroyed these documents as a protective safety measure. As a result of these conditions, many individuals across Iraq were left without legal identification. Remember that at one point, ISIS controlled up to 40% of territory in Iraq. So consider all the births, deaths, marriages, and so forth that occurred in that time. There was a generation, essentially, of children born in that period of ISIS control that therefore were not issued recognized birth certificates. Today, there are estimates of up to 1 million displaced or recently returned individuals lacking one or more pieces of civil documentation. Now, in order to obtain them, people face lengthy and complex administrative procedures, which might be difficult for them to understand, or that require other unavailable supporting documentation. So, for example, to obtain a civil ID, you might be required to have a birth certificate or other pieces of documentation, which you might likely also not have. Another barrier is the lack of administrative capacity and local offices to issue the documents. They might have lots of backlogs due to the high caseload. Another barrier is the lack of access to the civil administrative offices and courts because of their distance, the cost of transport, and the cost of the fees to issue and obtain these documents. But these are the issues broadly faced by individuals missing civil documentation in Iraq. However, for the specific group of persons with perceived affiliation, they face additional barriers, such as security clearance during the application process that might be required in some locations to undergo the tabriya, as mentioned by Dana, that is that denial of a family member before they can access and apply for their civil documentation. But even without this formal requirement, there are other challenges accessing civil documentation, perhaps also due to the high proportion of missing or dead family members, especially male family members, which in this patriarchal system really complicates the process for many accessing civil documentation. Or they might face other threats, such as blackmail or sexual exploitation when trying to apply and access for civil documentation, or threats to their safety, or a threat of arrest. A case shared by a colleague comes to my mind of an 11-year-old boy who went with his 8 sisters and mother to register for a civil ID and was informed immediately on the spot that he would be arrested as a male ISIS supporter. He would have been 7 years old at the time of ISIS control. So how can he be criminally liable as an ISIS fighter? So overall, protection actors in Iraq recognize the dual threats of the deprivation of civil documentation for those with perceived affiliation, as well as threat of limited capacity of the civil administration offices and courts to process them. In terms of impact, there is a direct impact on legal safety. So in other words, the right to legal identity and recognition by the state, I mentioned earlier. There's the impact to physical safety, including freedom of movement when crossing checkpoints. So you might need to pass several checkpoints for even local movements to access essential services, your market in your local town, or even your livelihood. And then thirdly, there's the threat, the risk of material safety, access to services, including health services, education, other social services, and the government's ration distribution system, or access to your housing, land, and property rights, and being able to reclaim your home. All of these require civil documentation. How this can play out in a single life is a complex web. A recent case comes to mind about a woman married during the period of ISIS control. She currently has no recognized marriage contract and now has 4 children, but with her husband missing or killed, both his family and her family refused to recognize her marriage and also her children. Now the children, it's been a few years, the children are of age to be registered for school, but they don't have any birth certificate, no proof of kinship, or their marriage contract to issue their civil IDs, let alone to register them for school. For the mother herself, she faces the potential stigma of having illegitimate children and non-recognized marriage, and the barrier to accessing pension or inheritance from her husband, which are essential resources, obviously, for a woman-led household. So in short, Belkis, having no legal identity means exclusion from rights, from services, and exclusion overall from society. That's not exactly the recipe for reconciliation.
Thank you for that. And I think that last example you put forward of the woman with 4 children, it leads me to my next question. And I think at this point in the conversation, it's really important to kind of zoom in and focus on the 2 specific groups within the population that are most impacted by this, women and children. This is because many of the families with perceived affiliation are female-headed, and many have young children. Samad, I was wondering if we could turn to you and ask you to provide us with a bit more detail on the way these collective punishment measures are directly impacting women and children specifically.
Thank you, Belkis. Yes, so as we know, because the topic is so sensitive, it is really difficult to quantify and determine the scale of the issues facing this category. And Kyla just described one example of many. So as we know, the risks and threats apply to both men and women with perceived affiliation, and of course affect their children as well. For collective punishment of women and children for being related, however distantly, to men linked to extremist groups or to affiliated groups. It takes the form of harassment from formal institutions like security, military forces, law enforcement, checkpoint guards, so on and so forth, and harassment and abuse from the communities who have suffered at the hands of ISIS. So collective punishment goes against the international criminal law principle of individual and personal responsibility, which is also enshrined in the Iraqi constitution and law. We've also already mentioned security clearance, which is a requirement by all administrative and judicial bodies within the Iraqi legal framework. The double jeopardy as well, if you're crossing from Kurdistan region of Iraq, and federal Iraq, and of course blocked returns due to lack of security clearance and civil documentation, and so harassment as well, and forced returns as a result of camp closures. Specifically for women and children, though, the specific protection risks and threats are stigma, as we already mentioned before, harassment, extortion, physical violence, gender-based violence, including exploitation and abuse, unlawful expropriation of targeted destruction of their housing, land, and property. For children, enhanced risk of child labor and child marriage, arbitrary detention of juveniles, and blocked family tracing for unaccompanied and separated children. These challenges are stemming, as we said, from formal and informal processes, including tabri'a, which is required, as we said, specifically from women, sometimes men against mainly men, but specifically is required from women, as women are usually not perceived to be fighters, but only as family members of fighters. So, because tabri'a is not a regulated process, there could be several issues that women face. For example, we in our programming, we have our lawyers on our teams. We have several examples where, for example, if a woman refuses to apply tabri'a, the lawyer cannot really provide any assistance. This doesn't mean that we support tabri'a, it just means that it's an impediment for us to provide support to the client. When the husband is in jail on charges of terrorism, our lawyer can provide assistance to the woman if she has already completed a tabri'a process against the person in jail, or if she chooses to divorce the husband in jail. And then if the husband is declared missing, as we already mentioned before, also assistance might not be possible unless the husband's family can be found. In that case, we come to Judgment 122 of the Federal Cassation Court, which was announced in March 2021, that provides additional impediments to women and children to obtain official documentation and access property and services. And these are requirements to register the marriage that were done outside of court. As we know, during ISIL, many of these marriages were outside the court. Rejection of any request further above if the father is missing or suspect. So the Iraqi law provides that if the husband is missing, the woman can go to the family of the husband to support with documenting the marriage, but sometimes, or the proof of lineage, but sometimes the family would refuse, that we've seen in a previous example. And for children, sometimes a requirement of DNA as proof of lineage, and one can only obtain that test in Baghdad, which costs some money and takes 2 to 3 weeks to have. And we already mentioned a little bit returns and the also issues that they would face on checkpoints. Worth noting as well that sometimes humanitarian workers and lawyers who support these women and children with perceived affiliation are often as well harassed. So we have several examples similar to the examples we were given from our programming. For example, Mukhtars and community actors extorting women with perceived affiliation in exchange for security clearance, facilitation to allow them entry back into their areas of origin, women including girls with perceived affiliations arrested by security forces and separated from their younger children until they obtain security clearance, or community actors harassing the women upon their return to their areas of origin, pushing them to change their residence. And of course, as we mentioned, these are all impediments for reconciliation. So the most important consequences we can see of those is, for example, legal precedents of unconstitutional legal provisions, enforcing systemic human rights abuses, increased gender inequality with women and girls being left behind for accessing services and participating in decision-making, and of course, peace building and reconciliation processes. And for children, a risk of lost generation with no education, no access to education, as we already mentioned, and increased crime rates and new waves of radicalization when they're marginalized, with continued community tensions and conflicts. Thank you, Balkis.
Thank you, Samad, for laying all out that multiplicity of issues that women and children are facing, as well as the community writ large who's facing the stigma. I wanted to turn now to you, Siobhan. So far, we've focused mainly in this discussion on the state-imposed collective punishment measures, but I'm wondering if you could broaden that out a bit for us and give us some details on what you see happening also at the community level, including the stigmatization of these families, which has already come up in the discussion, threats of violence, communal rejection, and maybe you could then add your thoughts on the longer term prospects for these families, both the potentially negative and positive, and some solutions that you see to addressing these problems of social cohesion.
Thanks very much, Belkis. And indeed, I think while there has been a softening of community attitudes to some extent over time, individuals with a perceived affiliation still face stigma and in some cases rejection and threats of retribution in their areas of origin. Therefore, while return to the area of origin is the government of Iraq's preferred durable solution, it's not always straightforward. And we've seen that unless it's managed effectively, it creates new forms of instability at the community level. In some instances, especially in the context of camp closure, families have tried to return to communities which were not ready to accept them. And as a result, these families were threatened and redisplaced. In addition, in what is now, I think, quite a large number of cases, families have managed to return but are left isolated, struggling to meet their basic needs and vulnerable to serious protection issues, including, in particular, GBV. For example, some months back, I visited Shurgat, a district of Salahuddin, and I met with families with a perceived affiliation who had been left with little choice but to return to their areas of origin after the government of Iraq closed the camps in which they were living. Many of their houses had been destroyed and they were living in tents pitched next to their former homes. They told me that community and tribal leaders had advised them to keep quiet and stay indoors to help avoid tension in the area spilling over into violence. And as humanitarian actors, while we're cognizant of their needs, we also know that we have to ensure utmost conflict sensitivity in the provision of any assistance to these households, or we may also trigger conflict. Because male relatives alleged to have collaborated with ISIS have often been killed or detained or missing, many households with a perceived affiliation have lost their traditional breadwinner. And as colleagues have mentioned, rumours of sexual exploitation are widespread. For women who were married to or the daughters of alleged members of ISIS, evolving customary norms require her to marry or remarry as kind of the only mechanism through which she can restore her honour. And remarriage in this context, including as second wives, can create additional protection concerns, including in terms of children from the first marriage who may then be separated from their mothers. When we first started to explore this issue in 2018, we engaged in extensive consultations to try to understand the factors contributing to stigmatisation rejection, with a view to then identifying measures which may help to promote community acceptance. What we learned is important because while the government of Iraq, especially at Baghdad level, often characterises these challenges as tribal issues, and I agree that there are issues which have often evolved along tribal lines, many of the factors which shape community rejection or acceptance fall within the government of Iraq's scope of influence. For example, one major reason that communities reject the return of families with a perceived affiliation is their sense that justice has not been served. Perhaps most importantly, while hundreds of thousands of claims have been filed under Iraq's compensation law, which covers civilian deaths and injuries and damage and destruction of property caused by ISIS or during military operations against ISIS, very little compensation has actually been paid. Communities often express how difficult it is to accept the return of individuals with a perceived affiliation, those who are seen as being on the other side of the conflict, before receiving any form of recognition or redress for the loss of their family members or the destruction of their property. Some of them are still living in tents or the remnants of their damaged houses because they don't have the resources to rehabilitate or rebuild their homes. As of today, I think that expediting the payment of compensation is probably the single greatest thing that the government of Iraq could do to promote community acceptance. At the same time, it's worth noting that accessing government compensation schemes is a right to all citizens affected by the recent conflict, but due to a range of issues, including linkages to the security screening process, families with a perceived affiliation are currently being excluded. In terms of the sense that justice has not been served, we also found limitations to and a lack of confidence in the criminal justice process which need to be addressed. In particular, practical restrictions on the publicity of hearings, lack of victim attendance in proceedings, and over-reliance on the charge of membership of a terrorist organisation limits the possibility of victims and their families, as well as the general public, seeing perpetrators held to account for the full range of crimes committed against them. Of course, and although it isn't the subject of this discussion, we also know and should acknowledge that other concerns related to trials under Iraq's counter-terrorism laws, such as over-reliance on confessions and anonymous witness statements, which place defendants at serious disadvantage compared to the prosecution, have given rise to new challenges, in particular related to false accusations which stem from local disputes. Looking beyond reparations and accountability, I've often been asked about possible value of truth, memory, and guarantees of non-recurrence in the post-ISIL context. I don't think I'm best placed to advise on which of these transitional justice mechanisms are politically viable in Iraq at this time, and I suspect many of them are not. But I do think these issues rest at the heart of the reluctance of many communities to accept back families with a perceived affiliation. As it stands, communities have very, very little reason to be confident conflict against ISIS, which for them was the cause of so much loss and so much trauma, will not recur. And on the contrary, I would say that the conditions which gave rise to the conflict persist in most communities. From this perspective, I'd also say that in order to enhance longer-term prospects for families with a perceived affiliation, there is a need to address issues related to the current security clearance process. This means, as colleagues have mentioned, in terms of availing solutions to families who are currently unable to leave camps because they cannot obtain a security clearance, and delinking security clearances and access to civil documentation, but also in terms of ensuring a more systematic, transparent and coherent approach to the security clearance process, which bolsters community confidence and mitigates the impact that the fragmentation of the security sector and the sidelining of some security actors is currently having. Finally, I just wanted to mention that, there have been numerous tribal agreements negotiated to facilitate these returns. But I think what we have seen, and I hope the issues that I've highlighted here really kind of make clear the importance of ensuring the community as a whole is sensitized, consulted, and engaged in discussions around return. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Siobhan, for those extremely sobering comments that I think really highlight for all of us on this panel, everyone listening, the urgency of the work that needs to be done to address these challenges, and the need of the government of Iraq and of the humanitarian community to continue to try and address these problems. I wanted to now turn to other esteemed colleagues on this panel. Based on your earlier remarks, based on what other colleagues have raised, I would love to hear from each of you, forward-looking, as Siobhan did in her last comments, putting forward some recommendations. I would love it if each of you could add some thoughts, some recommendations specifically to this audience we have with the European Humanitarian Forum, what people should have in their minds, what they should be thinking about when they think about how to address these extremely complex issues. So Dana, if I can turn to you first to hear any additional thoughts and recommendations you might have.
Thank you, Balkis. Ultimately, the government of Iraq needs to take action to delink security clearance to administrative and judicial processes, and needs to prohibit security actors from requiring this at the local level. In tandem, we feel that the government needs to facilitate rather than prevent these families in obtaining documents so that they're not excluded from opportunities, including education and other essential government services. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dana. Kayla, I'd love to turn to you and hear any further thoughts from your side.
Thanks. My final thought would be that while there is recognition that the context in Iraq is evolving, which calls for multiple layers of responses and actors, I would like to reiterate the continued importance of supporting humanitarian assistance to support the conflict-affected population, including the groups that we've been speaking about today, which, as Siobhan mentioned, are among the most at risk and are still highly represented, with it still in displacement. It is clear from our discussion that reaching this group is a difficult and sensitive issue. Humanitarian actors themselves face the risk of perceived affiliation for supporting the protection of the human rights of this group, and there were threats received against staff and in lawyers for providing legal assistance. The rights of this group should not be made a political or security issue. So for us, it really reemphasizes the importance of respect and adherence to humanitarian principles to reach this group, and the importance of humanitarian action. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And now to you, Samar.
Thank you. For IRC, we would like to advocate with the Parliament and the government of Iraq for alternative procedures for proving birth and marriage, especially for the most vulnerable and marginalized women and children. Continued humanitarian assistance to provide women and children with perceived affiliations with access to housing, land and property, and basic services, including livelihoods, and advocate with the relevant actors in Iraq to overcome overall barriers and customary norms preventing women and children from accessing housing, land and property, services, assistance, and justice. Thank you.
Siobhan, any last comments from your side?
Thanks, Balkis. For the audience today, and I would kind of mention that this is in the context of steep declines in the level of humanitarian funding in Iraq, and a situation of kind of acute and urgent gaps over the coming 3 to 6 months. I'd reiterate the importance of ensuring that solutions are identified prior to camp closure and maintaining humanitarian assistance to populations in displacement in order to avoid premature return, which might spill over into conflict. I'd also stress the importance of continued investment in the recovery of affected communities as a whole, including in targeted measures to promote social cohesion, but also in livelihood services and other measures to address the tangible reminders of conflict which stand in the way of our efforts to restore trust and promote peaceful coexistence. Finally, for the government of Iraq, I think that the next government has an important role to play in bolstering community confidence that lessons have been learned and that efforts will be made to address the underlying causes of conflict while also ensuring justice and accountability. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, we're going to end on that note. I want to thank my incredibly knowledgeable colleagues who spoke today, Dana, Kayla, Samar, and Siobhan. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for listening to my colleagues' thoughts on this very important topic, and hopefully coming away with some clear recommendations that you have now in your mind on what can be done to try and address the obstacles these families are facing, but also writ large to address the current state in Iraq, a country that really needs now to move in the direction of durable solutions and reconciliation among communities. So thank you very much, and goodbye.